My college boyfriend broke my heart, but now he's come back 20 years later begging for my help, and I don't know how my politician husband is going to react. You can call me Marion, 42F. I'm a political consultant now, well, but once upon a time I had a soul. I was an artist, and I went to a small liberal arts college in the Northeast, one of those where all the kids have rich parents, and I've already been to rehab twice. But my parents weren't rich and caffeine was my drug of choice, and I'd gotten in on sheer talent alone. I blew the English department away with my poetry, and I'd already been published multiple times. Of course, being on a full-ride scholarship while being around a bunch of rich kids isn't easy, so I decided to deal with it by keeping my mouth shut about my real background. I concocted a wild fake origin story about my wealthy parents in Denmark. My fake father would be one of the biggest and most successful game show producers in the country's history, and my fake mother was descended from Danish royalty. I tried to be as obscure on all of the details as I possibly could with people, sometimes changing names of places and people. It didn't really matter if they thought I could be lying. Everybody lied about everything around here. But it would be much worse for me if they found out I was actually from what's so often insultingly referred to as flyover country. Throughout my 4 years at this particular college, there was only one person I told the truth to about who I really was. His name was Eli, and we fell madly in love. I really hate to use such a cliched expression, but that's the only way I can describe it. I was head over heels and so was he, but thankfully we'd been friends for a brief time first. He was in one of my workshops and was the only one to not be totally up his own butt about his poems. Everyone else thought they were the second coming of Shakespeare, but Eli wasn't afraid to let them know that they were far from it. I don't know if he was only doing it for my benefit or not, but he'd be the only person to call out someone's bad poem for what it was. Even our professor had to pathetically tap dance around it when we all knew the obvious. But just as much as Eli was quick to call out someone's BS poetry, he'd praise them for work he found brilliant. Eli just wasn't like the other students there. He was actually a real person I could talk to about things, who wouldn't look at me like some sort of weirdo if I told him the truth. At first he was more than a little confused when I told him. He was one of the ones who believed me and thought my parents actually lived in Denmark, not Oklahoma. He actually seemed to know less about Oklahoma than he did about Denmark for some reason. When I finally got him on board with what was going on, a big smile crept from ear to ear. I asked him what was so funny, and he said that nothing was funny, it's just that all of this checks out. What checks out? I said. What he said blew my mind. Well, you're obviously way more interesting than any of the other girls here, and I think that's one of the subconscious reasons I've been attracted to you. You're a real woman, and these rich phonies at this school are probably threatened by that. To say I was taken aback would be an understatement. I had had dreams that he was falling in love with me, and it's not that I thought he was, but it was a start, right? Well, things kind of escalated from there, and within a few months, we were inseparable. If it had still been the horrible prison that was my little high school, there was no doubt that we'd be voted cutest couple. By senior year, we were closer than ever. I was hoping and even expecting that he'd pop the question at any time, but it never came. I didn't have a lot of friends, but the ones I had were pressuring me to finally ask him about it. Knowing what I know now, being the person I am now, I of course never would have done it. But I was young and dumb, and I guess I wanted what so many girls from my hometown had already. A husband and a family. I wasn't as career-oriented then as I am now. I picked the worst time possible to do it. It was right before spring break. We were going to be spending it separately that year. He needed to go back home and see his family, and so did I. I hadn't seen my grandparents since Thanksgiving, and I guess Grandma was begging for me to spend more time with them before I graduated. So he and I wouldn't be seeing each other for a whole week, and it ended in a terrible fight about our future. Basically, he said that he was in no rush to get married, and that he wanted to focus on getting his doctorate and becoming a professor, and that all of this was just way too much for him. I honestly couldn't believe it. I thought he would at least be receptive to the idea, but instead he was adamantly opposed. I finally decided to just leave it alone and see where things stood when I got back from spring break, but things aren't any better. In fact, they were much worse. I guess he had a lot of time to think while we were apart. We didn't really talk a whole lot that whole week because we were both so busy with our families. I guess things really changed for him in the meantime, because he sat me down and said that he decided to end our relationship. I thought I was having an out-of-body experience at first. My heart seemed to sink into my chest, then my stomach, then my knees and feet. Then it spilled out all over the floor into a big puddle all around us. I begged him, I pleaded for him not to leave me. It was horribly pathetic in hindsight, but all I can do is tell myself that I was young and in love and I didn't know what I was doing. Which of course is all true. The rest of the year was a haze. I honestly have no idea how I finished any of my classes, but I somehow graduated without ending up in a mental health ward. But after that, after I moved back home and needed to figure out what to do with my life, that was when the real crash happened. It was like a black hole of depression had swallowed me whole. I made the mistake of following him on social media, and as much as he was living his life and succeeding, I was circling the drain. After watching me graduate college and being so proud, watching me not be able to get out of bed all day killed my parents. Finally they decided to have an intervention and I actually got the help I needed. I eventually became inspired by some local political campaigns and decided to go back to school and study political science. I started out small, and I really felt like I was making a difference, really helping my community. But then I got too good at my job. I became in demand, and then I ended up working on some of the biggest campaigns of the last 20 years, with some of the most successful candidates. But the bigger I got, the less good I felt I was actually doing. And when I met Martin while working on his campaign for state senate, I guess falling in love with him felt like just going through the motions. So there I was, a poet who hasn't written a poem in 10 years, now a political consultant married to a politician, and with no interest in having kids. I'd come a long way from the wannabe artist of my high school years, and even longer from the wannabe mom and wife of my senior year in college. I had not kept up with anyone from my old class. I decided that I just wanted to forget that entire time in my life. I wanted to somehow will my brain to push out all of the memories of Eli, even the good ones. But heads still pop up in the occasional dream, or the random 3 a.m. thought when I'd be staring up at the ceiling fan, counting the rotations. I had no idea where he was or what he was doing. I deleted all of my social media after my mental health intervention all those years ago and just never picked back up on it. Except for business contacts, I have no communication with anyone in my life before the age of 22. I should mention that my husband lost his bid for state senate, but he's now mayor of our small town and I consult remotely on national campaigns. To be honest, his parents' family is wealthy, so there's no real need for me to bust my butt on the trail anymore. But honestly, it gives me a little bit too much time to sit around at home and think. On some days, my thoughts drifted to Eli and our days of young, stupid bliss in the Northeast. And then a few hours ago, I got an email. It was Eli. I have no idea how he got my email address. He started out with all of the usual stuff about how long it's been, and how we're so much older and all of that, but then he got right down to the point. He was in trouble, and he needed my help. He was vague on the details. I almost get the sense that he didn't want to discuss whatever it was in writing. Like he didn't want any electronic record of our conversation. All he said was that he really needed to speak with me, and he wondered if we could meet for a drink later. I have no idea where Eli moved to after I lost track of him, but I knew it hadn't been to our little town. He's obviously here just to see me. What am I supposed to do except say yes? And besides, I honestly don't hold any resentment towards him. It's been 20 years. I'm sure that we were both totally different people. Martin is out of town for the next few days on a trip to the capital, so he doesn't need to know about it. But if I feel the need to not tell him, is what I'm doing wrong? I mean, he's not even the jealous type anyway. Eli said in the email that I could pick the place and time, and I think I'm going to do it. I know everyone will have plenty of opinions about this in the comments, but I've made up my mind, and I honestly can't explain why, but it wasn't even much of a choice. I'll let everyone know how it goes. Update 1. Hey everyone, so I didn't mean to leave you hanging, and I definitely have quite the update for you. So we met at the phone booth lounge at 8 o'clock, in a little booth in the back. I have to say, he looked nothing like I remembered. Long gone were those boyish good looks and thick auburn hair. Now it was just thin and graying, and too long for his tired, gaunt face. He was thin and pale, and he looked like he hadn't showered or changed his clothes in days. I simply couldn't believe my eyes. I tried my best to pretend like nothing strange was going on. I gave him a hug and tried not to breathe in too deep. I thought for a moment, was this man an imposter? He finally broke the tension but addressed the smelly elephant in the room head on. He said that the last few years hadn't been kind to him, to say the least. After college he'd gotten his doctorate and landed a teaching position right out of the gate. He got his tenure within just a few years at a prestigious university and WSS on track for a long and successful career. But then he had a back injury while skiing in Colorado with his dad, and a series of surgeries led to painful recoveries that required more and more pills. Eventually he found himself addicted and slowly spinning out of control. The university finally began to take notice when students started complaining of him falling asleep at his desk. They tried to give him a few more dances, which he always ended up messing up, and pretty soon his career was pretty much finished. And that's when the really bad times began. I honestly didn't know what he was asking from me. His parents were wealthy. Why could they just pay for him to go to some fancy tropical rehab or something? It turns out that his parents cut him off too. There was literally no one else in Eli's life that he could turn to. Even his dad, who was there when he first hurt his back, turned his owner away from him. I finally realized that Eli didn't want anything from me. All he really wanted was for someone familiar to listen. He needed someone from his past who had known him before he was like this to hear his story. But it couldn't have been just anyone. It had to have been me. But why? And how did he get all the way here from wherever he came from? He had answers for that as well. How he'd gotten here was no mystery. He'd taken a Greyhound bus from San Francisco where he'd been living on the streets for a few months. He'd spend most of his time during the day in libraries reading while he was trying to stay sober, and one day he got curious enough to look me up. Eli's research skills were always top-notch, even in college, so I guess I'm not all that surprised that he was able to find me. I guess I was a little surprised he decided to show up here instead of calling. But he said he wanted to see my face, and he needed to hear my voice in person. He needed something to anchor him to the person he once was. That it was the only way he could become that again. I honestly didn't quite understand what he was talking about, but I gave him the benefit of the doubt knowing that he was in a great deal of pain. I noticed that he was only drinking ginger ale, so at least he was trying. I decided to order one myself after my first drink to be polite. I didn't want to drink in front of a guy trying not to. After he finally calmed down and had some dinner, which he insisted he pay for even though I wanted to. We were finally able to actually have a good time. We reminisced about the old days, the old times both good and bad, and in the dim lighting of the neon bar lights I could still see that handsome boy under there somewhere. He showed me some of his recent poems. Even throughout all of his hard times, he'd never stopped writing. He was better than he'd ever been. I was ashamed to tell him I'd quit writing years ago, but he understood. He encouraged me to pick it back up again, and said that all it takes is one poem to break the creative dam. I had an urge to offer him a place to stay, to let him clean himself up and sleep as long as he wanted. Martin would find it quite interesting, wouldn't he? If he came home and found a strange man sleeping in his house. But then again, he wouldn't be home for a few days. No, I decided it wasn't a good idea. Maybe I'm wrong, but I seemed to have filled whatever need he had in seeing me. When we called it a night, it seemed like a 2-ton boulder had been lifted off his shoulders. We both agreed to keep in touch, and I told him that I wanted to hear all about the success and progress I knew he was going to have. He smiled at me, but it was kind of a sad smile, like he wasn't sure he could live up to those expectations. But I truly hope he does. Anyway, I'm off to bed now. I'm physically and emotionally exhausted, and my subconscious brain needs to make sense of everything that just happened. Update 2. It's been a month, and if anyone is still following this, I have some good news about Eli. He's still sober and managed to get himself off the streets for the time being. He's staying in the barn behind our house. Now, I know you probably have a few questions. But don't worry, it's a converted barn with a bathroom and everything, and Martin is totally okay with it. In fact, he thinks that helping a homeless drug addict will be great for his re-election prospects. Pretty cynical, right? That's what I get for marrying a politician. I can't say there's any real attraction between Eli and I anymore. At least not any that could lead to anything. But we have a poetry workshop every other day at 3 p.m., just him and I have to say, I really missed it.